Hey, Alana, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Sorry, I tried. It's kind of chaotic. My son's taking over the house. He's here, so it's fine. Don't worry, don't worry. It's all good.
No worries, no worries.
We're low key here, so if you need a break or you got to go assist, go right ahead. He's a teenager, is that right? I think I've seen you
Yeah,
say.
13.
Well, just I don't forget if I told you this when we invited you on. We do a lot of spoilers. We like to bring authors on and really actually ask them about the plot and the characters and what
Yeah.
happened. So this is a spoiler-filled interview, so I hope you're
Okay.
okay with
No, that's
that.
great. I listened to your discussion of my book, and thank you for that. I thought it was so thoughtful, your discussion, and I mean there were things you talked about that I hadn't thought of, and I also know I'm not probably a typical book that you guys read.
Right.
So
Right.
so I appreciate you guys kind of going outside the norm.
Well, I think, it's a typical book that I think me and Mike would read. It was interesting we actually covered it for we have a couple patrons who had really been wanting us to cover more female authors, which I think there needs to be more female authors in this genre. And your book highly touted, highly praised, so we wanted to read it. I loved it.
Thank you.
And Mike actually just reread it, and I think he loves it even more. I had a feeling that upon reread it would hit a little bit differently. But yeah, it was interesting to have this book discussion with them. We had it about a month after we released our pod on it, and you know, it definitely was not like in the Mitch rap genre that some of our listeners are typically into. But they gave it a shot. They liked aspects of it, and some of the things we want to ask you about, like Collins and some of the
Yeah.
characters, I think really hit with them. And it's I feel like your book is a lot more cerebral. It
Yeah.
requires a lot of thinking, and I like that sometimes. Like when I want to like actually be engaged with the novel in that way.
Yeah. I think that is a compliment.
I guess before we get into that kind of stuff, can we give us a little bit of a background about who you are? We know the broad strokes. You stationed in Baghdad. You did some time in Bahrain. Definitely want to talk to you about Bahrain because
Yeah.
this is a field or a location that we haven't really covered in any of our other novels. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm a lawyer by training. But I never really practiced much law. And I was a spy for 6 years and spent a year in Baghdad during the war, and then 2 years in Bahrain after I left the CIA. So a lot of people think I served in the CIA in Bahrain, but I didn't.
Okay.
And a mom.
How in a mom? Yeah. How was juggling all of that, being there in Baghdad during that time? Like what was that like?
Baghdad was rough. Yeah, I mean, have either of you been to the Middle East or to a war zone?
No.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was there kind of during the apex of the war, late 2004 to late 2005. And it was rough. I mean, we were getting bombed every day, and there was really this fog of war. And we had to make, I was part of a team that was trying to track down Zarqawi, who was the leader of
Oh,
Al Qaeda in Iraq. And we weren't making much progress, and we were having to make decisions in this sort of fog of war and espionage. And one of the operations I've talked about before was I helped through one of my informants to apprehend an alleged top 10 terrorist target who was accused of participating in the 2003 bombing of UN headquarters in Baghdad. And then, so we were successful. We detained him. And then years later, find out maybe we had the wrong guy.
mm,
And it was sort of a moment of reckoning for me. And it stayed with me. It still stays with me even to this day. Like, I don't know if I saved lives. I don't know if maybe I ruined a life. I don't know. It's sort of the fog of war and espionage, I think. And I don't blame anyone. I did the best I could. I think we all did the best we could. But I think that really came out in the Peacock and the Sparrow in ways that I didn't see until afterward, even. Just this guy who makes decisions that he doesn't know if they're right, and they affect the course of the Arab Spring and ultimately the world.
right.
And I think so. In that way, I think it was kind of cathartic. I had all these kind of ghosts rattling around in my brain.
You paint a picture of the daily life of a case officer. You kind of portray Bahrain as like the place that case officers go to put out to pasture almost, like,
Yeah.
it's a wayward station. What was it like, what you can tell us of your day to day, was it the similar what you portray in your novel?
Yeah, well, I was not a case officer in Bahrain.
Okay.
Baghdad was a big station and very important at the time. But I was familiar. I'd served in some smaller stations. I don't think I can talk about them, but they are very much like that. They're like onesie, twosie, they call them stations with just a few people. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of where you go, unless you're a young station chief, which would be like a springboard for you.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And all that comes through with this panel of characters that you've made. It almost feels like an extended family where everyone has their quirks and different ways of relating to one another. I can only imagine that came out of maybe not a one-to-one of people you met or had to work with, and the frustrations often of people you have to work with. Did you base your characters off of individuals that you had to work with, or more of this like type? There was a general type of a Jimmy, of a Whitney, of a Poppy Johnson.
Yeah, it was definitely more of a general type. Yeah, most of the characters are composites. The station chief, Whitney Alden Mitchell, was based on a real person.
Okay.
And yeah, and the expats were largely based on real people, and including the dialogue, which I actually took from a lot of real conversations. I mean, I just couldn't make dialogue like that up. It was like actual things people said, ridiculous things like, oh, this country has more freedom of religion than America,
Mm.
because more freedom because we can wear what we want and we can wear, luxury goods and
Right, right.
gemstones. And someone actually said that.
Some of when we were talking to our listeners, that they brought that up, that they thought that some of the stuff was too accurate to not be true, or not to be like something that you had actually experienced. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's funny.
and funny story. I don't know if you guys remember the nativity scene in the book, the controversy on the naval base when they'd erected
Oh
the
yeah,
nativity
yeah.
scene, and they were trying to eject this guy who had complained about it. True story, really happened. I think it actually made the headlines at like CNN at the time or something. But it was just, I mean, whatever the merits of the debate, the fact that this is what expats were concerned about
Sure.
amid this huge, this conflagration, this conflict that was kind of sweeping the island, and this is what expats were focused on.
Yeah.
It's crazy. You have this tiny island, and just this one little imaginary barrier, and you have one side thinking about completely different things than
Right.
others.
They were just in their little bubble. I mean, they
Yeah.
were so disconnected. That's what I found. And my son was a toddler at the time, and I would try to take him out and see the country and explain things to the extent I could. But most of the expats were sort of happy to just live in their own sort of insular, privileged bubble.
And there's a danger to that, though. And I feel like that's a theme, particularly with the journey of Shane Collins. And I said this on our podcast. He kind of embodies the danger of it is what it is, or this blase and hubris filled attitude towards one's career when the stakes are as big as shifting the global balance of powers. So I actually want to get into some of the details here. I was blown away at the end how much this washed up drunkard of a case officer who I've got to say, I ended up hating the second time I read this book. I didn't see it the first
Oh,
time.
really? Okay. Okay. All right.
I didn't see it, but every time he kept saying, I'm a good spy. Every time he kept trying to rationalize his mistakes. And when I finally realized this book is almost a memoir of him recalling these events, it almost he's digging himself deeper into the grave of him trying to rationalize these decisions that not only put America on the back foot, it empowered Iran, it empowered a group of radicals who end up getting manipulated themselves. He was just another cog in the wheel, but he made himself a very important cog by how highly he thought of himself. Were you trying to kind of hint to the readers this guy maybe shouldn't be your friend?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me he was a complex character. To me, he
Sure.
wasn't all that. Like in his own way, I think he was trying to do the right thing and didn't. But I also, to me, when I think of Collins, I think of delusion. Like I think in his way, he
Yeah, definitely.
tries to convince himself that he did the right thing because that's what you kind of have to do, and that's what you do as a case officer. And I mean, to me, I tried to sort of represent the profession of espionage, which is that they had a saying at the farm, perception is reality. They would always tell us that over and over. Perception is reality. And that was sort of one of my points is, which is the right side in the Arab Spring? Well, it kind of depends on how you look at it or what you tell yourself. Like, what's the story we all tell each other? What's the story in foreign policy that we tell each other? I mean, you can see it now in the Middle East with the Gaza conflict. You have these two competing narratives. And which is the right one? I mean, it really depends on who's telling the story and what the perspective is. And I think that's true of so many conflicts, so many foreign affairs, especially post-Cold War. So that was sort of my point, is that he's sort of a vessel of espionage and that sort of malleability.
Mm.
Yeah, and you talked about the gray zone and that moral gray ambiguity when you were abroad.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to think on my second reread, I was asking myself, who's the villain?
Right. I'm glad you told that.
I don't have an answer to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I love to hear that. I think that's great.
I found myself rooting for Rashid and Almaisa on my second reread, knowing what they were going to do and knowing how they're playing our side, if you're talking from an American perspective. But I still like them. Almost what they were doing was noble, at least in their mind. They were true believers,
Right.
and they committed themselves to that.
Exactly. I think they were true believers. I think that's true. And that was sort of my point too, that there is no clear right side in humans, in the Arab Spring, in espionage. I think the lines really get blurred. I mean, you have the admiral who is supposed to be the good guy, and he turns out to be, totally corrupt.
I'd say he's probably the biggest villain of the story.
He probably is. Yeah.
Yeah. Jimmy's an interesting character to throw in.
Yeah, I know. I mean, my point with Jimmy was sort of everybody had something to hide. Everybody had a backstory that they were hiding.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, even Rashid and Al-Maisa, I think in their own ways were sympathetic. They turned out to kind of be villains in the end, of course, but I think they had, as you said, they were true believers and they had their own motivations. And Al-Maisa had a very traumatic childhood, as did Collins, which is one of the reasons I added that in, because I do think that made him, at least to me, more sympathetic.
Mm.
And,
yeah, definitely.
And I found in real life, increasingly, I find that people who do really crazy things all have like traumatic childhoods.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a connection with everything. Yeah. So this was another question that's kind of been bugging me, and I think Mark might have asked this when he got a chance to meet you. It was last week.
That was so nice of him to
yeah.
stop on.
So in my mind, I had this feeling that Rashid and Al-Maisa were working together. Was this something that you were, this is just something like the reader can think about? Were you thinking about this, or am I out on left field?
No, you were. Yeah, Mark asked me that. I loved that he asked that question, that you're asking that question. I absolutely wanted to plant that question in the reader's mind.
Okay.
And I said to Mark, I don't 100% know if I resolved it in my own mind. I kind of wanted to leave a little reserve of mystery, even for myself. But I definitely hint at that throughout the book. There's a moment where Rashid says, "Oh, I can tell you're seeing a new woman," or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. And Collins is just like, "Oh, he's really perceptive," or
exactly.
whatever. But yeah, but it kind of, I wanted to sort of raise your mind. Is there something else going on?
I like that. I feel like you've done a couple different things where you've left it up. You don't give us the definitive answer. You left it up to the reader to sort of think about that. That's, I'm getting this idea of the book being a little more cerebral than some of the other stuff.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, that if I had to say one kind of theme of the book, it's that espionage is a profession of unanswered questions.
Very true.
That's what it left me with, and I didn't even realize it fully until, over the years, there were these operations and, ghosts of things that I had done and things that had happened, things I'd seen and witnessed in Baghdad. And then when I wrote the book, I was just like, I can see those things on the page. And I wanted to leave, I wanted to leave sort of unanswered questions for the reader to think about.
That makes the second reread, in my opinion, I had a much more enjoyable time reading it the second time because those questions had so many little sprinkles and hints along the way. It's almost like you were running us, you were kind of playing the reader saying, are you going to see this? Are you going to pick up on this? Do you have the skills of a spy to piece this together? And at the end, it's like, I missed most of it. It took a book club discussion with some of my closest friends like Chris and our listeners before I finally was able to put the pieces together. And so when I reread a line like the one you mentioned, where Collins is thinking, "Oh, Rashid's really perceptive." I'm like, "No, it's because maybe they're working together. You should have seen it." Or even another one, the Molotov cocktail. So
Yeah.
I'm like, "Is this supposed to be a very gripping, exciting action scene?" And it just didn't come off that way. But when I
Right.
read it the second time, I'm like, "Oh my God, this guy is in deep and doesn't even know it."
Right.
And
Right.
Exactly.
and he has to prove to himself, I had free will. I made this choice. I wasn't played by this guy who
Right.
handed it to me and said, throw it.
Exactly. I'm so glad you said that. And by the way, thank you, if I didn't say it already, for reading my book twice. That's amazing.
I recommend
um,
everybody do that. I really, really do.
I mean, I can't even stand to read my book again, but I've read it like 5 times.
Yeah.
Um,
It's so much better second
but
reread. I had just an
thank
absolute
you.
joy
Thank you.
rereading it.
Oh, thank you. That makes my day. But yeah, I mean, so initially, I think I had even written it so that I think I had made it clearer that perhaps, I think I had hinted more strongly that perhaps Rashid had set up that whole Molotov cocktail, that he had planned. I mean, there are these kind of little clues like, oh, the riot started at a different time than they thought, and he kind of knew that they would get trapped,
Yep.
and that Collins would be forced to participate, and also the shooting of the policeman.
Mm.
Yes.
In the epilogue, initially, I had again hinted more strongly that, oh, maybe that was a big setup,
Right.
because why was she kind of following him? Like, what was the deal with that?
And there was one
Why did
bullet.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. And I had kind of hinted more strongly that maybe this was all a big setup the whole time.
Right.
And that was in my mind that Rashid from the beginning was really co-opting. He was the one trying to recruit and get Collins over to his side. But when I went back, I thought, I'm going to make this more subtle. I'm going to let the reader figure it out about what's happening. Because to me, that's espionage.
Right.
Is
Yeah.
like, you have to figure out, what's the truth? Is this guy
Yeah.
telling you the truth or not?
Especially having your book be 100% from Collins's perspective, there's no reason that he would
Right.
have those, unless, yeah, exactly. We are fully put into his mind and how he is seeing it as it's unfolding.
Yeah,
Right.
and at first I thought that was a limitation on my first read. I was like, I kind of want to see the other pieces of this puzzle as they're being played, but it actually ended up being so much fun just locked into his narrative, which was unreliable. And then I didn't
Mhm.
even pick up on all the drinks along the way. He
Yeah.
mentions his liver a bunch, and eventually when he's released from CIA, drinking is on there, and I didn't even see it. And then Chris told me, "Did you know he was drunk this entire time?" And then when like he didn't know if it was Whitney and Elmisa at that safe house, that fisherman's house, and he
Right.
didn't know if it was Waleed's shoes.
Right.
All those little clues were so much fun as I'm thinking, can I even trust the person telling me this story?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's also sort of the point, that truth is elusive.
Mhm.
What is the truth? And he was definitely an alcoholic. I think that the alcohol kind of served as a sort of literary device for the fog the fog of truth.
Yeah. I guess to transition a little bit, how did you get into wanting to write this story?
Well, spending 2 years in Bahrain, it was almost 2 years, and the conflict was fascinating. Pretty much everything in my story is true to life except for the ending.
Mhm.
And I did change the names of the royal family because I thought that might get me in trouble, given the ending. So, but other than that, I mean, I found the country and the conflict so inspiring. And I thought someone should write about this. Nobody writes about the Arab Spring, really. I mean, I think there's like a dearth of literature on the Arab Spring, particularly in fiction. I mean, the only book I can think of that comes to mind, the Cairo Affair by Olin Steinauer,
Mm.
touches on the Arab Spring, but really that's the only one I can think of. And I thought this is fascinating, and it's this perfect conflict in that there's no clear right side. It's sort of the perfect prism for espionage. And initially I started writing, well, actually, initially it was kind of like an espionage tinted thriller. It wasn't really a spy novel so much. But when I wrote it, in fact, I think I had like NCIS or something I knew nothing about, and then I had a couple espionage scenes, and when I reread them, those were clearly the best scenes. Those were clearly the most authentic, and those were what I could write about. So I kind of pivoted and rewrote the whole thing as a spy novel, and that's when and I kind of knew that I kind of knew the story. I knew what I wanted to tell. I knew I wanted to I had these experiences from spying sort of rattling around in my brain, and I thought, here's the Arab Spring. This is the perfect prism. And I took a lot of inspiration from The Quiet American, which I don't know if you guys read The Quiet American. No. Well, I recommend it. It's a slow burn like mine. So not a shoot 'em up spy novel, but to me, it's the classic, the best spy novel ever written. I think it's actually the best book ever written. It's about an aging British journalist who is in Vietnam. It's very similar to my book. I took a lot of inspiration from Graham Greene, but he's vying with his young CIA rival who comes into the country. He's naive, he's optimistic, he thinks he can fix Vietnam. And here's this aging British journalist who thinks that this kid's just naive and doesn't know what he's doing. And the British journalist says, don't take a side. You need to just remain on the sidelines, much like Collins, who says, I don't get involved. I don't get involved. The Quiet American's kind of the cautionary tale against involvement. But of course, in the end, they get into a lover's spat. I mean, they both are vying for the same woman in the book, in The Quiet American, and much like in my book. And that personal conflict pulls the British journalist into the geopolitical conflict. So in the end, he gets involved. I won't spoil the ending of The Quiet American for you, but suffice it to say, it parallels mine. There are echoes of. It has a similar ending to mine.
That's enticing. So, yeah. The ending almost hits you when everything is being broken down about the geopolitical fallout of honestly what this one guy has done. I know it's bigger with the admiral and everything, but it really comes down to him being the mule to bring those poison vials back from Cambodia. It comes down to him getting so caught up in Rashid and Al-Maisa's web, you almost couldn't bring down a king that symbolized partnership with America without Collins doing what he did.
Right.
That was just shocking. To some readers, I think it felt like the end almost justified everything else that took place in the book. Were you worried at all that it would take too long to get there and that readers really would have to stick it out before those things fell into place? Or were you happy that it came out that way?
I think a little of both. I think that the last third is definitely my favorite part of the book, and it was the easiest to write. I felt like it wrote itself.
It's the key.
Yeah, and I had always intended that. I had in my mind exactly what was going to happen at the end, and it was sort of a long build up to that. To me, the books I'd always read, I mean, full disclosure, I never read a lot of really fast paced thrillers. So that wasn't really my model going in. I had always read sort of the slow burn. I didn't read a lot of thrillers, period, to be honest, but I read just a lot of literature in general. So that was sort of my framework, when I was writing. And it really didn't hit me until I kind of entered the thriller verse that wasn't a typical thriller novel. Now I realize that. And now I see when people say, oh, it's slow burn. And I know that's not for everyone. I know there are people who, read and are like, this just isn't for me because there's not action right off the beginning. And it is more cerebral. I think it's more psychological.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been just a learning process for me as a writer that I think every writer, their challenge is to find their readers. It's a rare author that pleases everyone. There are some, but I'm not one of them. So yeah.
You might not necessarily want to because, and Chris and I will both say we are guilty of the guilty pleasure, the summer beach read, the action-paced Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp. And in fact, our whole podcast and fan base is about that. Yet every once in a while, there comes this sneaky genius who slips something into the typical thriller verse that is it's such a level above. Like we will both agree, all the Vince Flynn and Brad Thor books we read, while they might become bestsellers, that's a flash in the pan. That's your readers looking for a cheap thrill who love these things and have to buy it every year. But then there are some that become art. And I have to say, your book and like David McCloskey's recent books,
Yes.
they automatically stand out as literature, high art, I would even call them. And I think that's brilliant. And we have to try to kind of bring readers to both sides to give them a taste of that, to know books like yours, very erudite, very, very elevated, are out there and a whole lot of fun to read.
No, that means everything to me. I totally appreciate that. And I like I said, I mean, I think it's been a process for me, and I love to hear that, because I do feel like there are probably people who wouldn't look at my book because it's not that, it doesn't fit the mold of a typical thriller. So
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, they need to give it a chance because
thank you.
Same thing
Yeah,
happened with The Spy Who Came In From the
I
Cold.
was just
We
going to
had
say
a lot
that.
of our readers and we wanted to cover it because we did want to touch on these classics, and it just doesn't hit with some people. And the modern audience is so different, and that's okay. But you
Yes.
do have to recognize that there are some things out there, and I would put your book right up in that category, that are lasting pieces of literature and not just cheap, throwaway beach reads.
That means everything to me. Thank you. And by the way, I've often wondered if Le Carre could even get a lot of his books published nowadays, to be honest.
Yeah,
It's
no,
true.
it's
It's true.
I've read a couple of them recently, and I don't, and especially, have you noticed with, I don't know, talking to editors, like the push to have shorter and shorter books and shorter chapters, where it's almost like they're trying to appease people who, this TikTok era where people are,
Yeah.
they want these quick bites.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely. No, it's true. I mean, I definitely see a lot of kind of alarming trends in the publishing industry, and that's one, which is, that people have shorter attention spans. And I don't mean that as a criticism of certain kinds of thriller books. I think that absolutely, has an audience. I'm just saying in general that people tend to, they want things shorter, snappier.
yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned Le Carre, and I brought up Spy Who Came In From the Cold. There was a YouTube clip. It was like 30 seconds of Le Carre explaining how he came up with Alec Lemus. And he just said one day he caught himself daydreaming. I don't know if you heard this story. And he said, I'm just imagining, and I don't know if this is a real person from my memory or I just made it up one day. This kind of haggardly down on his luck spy in a foreign country, forgot where he was, doesn't even know where he's operating, goes into a bar, orders a drink, can't pay for it, pulls out a wad of various currencies from all over the world, slaps it on the bar. And I'm just like, I didn't see it. Now I'm like, Alec Lemus and Shane Collins, there's a lot. But maybe there's some eternal truth there about how hard espionage is on the personal psyche and a person's character.
For sure. And that was another big part of the book, was sort of the toll manipulation takes on you,
Yeah.
and how much a part of espionage manipulation is. And it takes a toll on the person, of course, that you're manipulating, right? You're doing this kind of bad thing to someone, you're manipulating them, but the person who does the manipulating also bears a cost. I mean, because it wears you down, it wears down who you are as a person.
Yeah.
And that, that was very much my experience in spying. And if I had to give one reason why I left the agency after 6 years as a spy, that would be it. That it just never sat right with me. It just wasn't, it just was always an uneasy fit, because you're always trying to convince people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. And I think it really takes a toll on who you are. I mean, I remember a moment in Baghdad when I was trying to recruit a woman, and we were using her as an access agent. Doesn't really matter, but she had just gotten divorced she was going through a divorce with her husband, and we were having lunch in the green zone, and she wanted to show me, pictures of this woman that her husband that she was getting divorced from he was cheating on her. And she was just looking for a shoulder to cry on. She was looking for another woman. There weren't a ton of women in green zone. And she just wanted a shoulder to cry on. She just wanted to talk to me. And the whole time I'm thinking, okay, how can I use this to get her on our side? How can I manipulate this divorce that she's going through so that she'll do what we want her to do? And it was like this moment where you feel really shitty about yourself.
Yeah.
You know?
You can't ever be a true person, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you feel slimy
Hmm.
Yeah.
and shitty.
Think
And
about the orphanages that they used. The orphanage was the front, and like Sanaa,
yeah,
did Elmisa care for the
yeah.
girl or not? I don't know. And what
I mean, I
happened
think
to
she
her?
did because
I think so too.
yeah, because she was a true believer in her mind. I think that the two were not mutually exclusive,
Mm.
Yeah.
that I think it was all part of the good, part of the cause. One of the questions I loved the question Mark asked me at the book festival. No one had asked me that before. He said, why would she have, killed herself at the end if she had
Mm,
this love for this child, which I never thought of because I was like, wow, that's such a great point. And my answer was that because she's a true believer, which I
right.
think
Mm.
when you're a true believer, that trumps everything.
Right.
Yeah, and this comes to a point that I forget. I think Chris, you said this, and it blew my mind. I want to see Almisa having that conversation with herself or just stewing over, I love Sanaa, but even she has to be a cause for the revolution to continue. I have to sacrifice her, my relationship with her, being there for her to go do this thing, and that radicalization taking hold. I want to see a story. We were both saying on the podcast, how amazing would it be to see exactly what Rashid and Almisa are doing all this time that we're with Collins doing his, shenanigans and getting drunk somewhere or going off with these prostitutes. And we're like, what's Rashid doing to play the game? What's
Right. Right.
Almisa doing to stake them out when she's taking those photographs and following
Yeah.
him? Would you ever consider that? Is that something that kind of you have a spark to do down the road?
Well, funny enough, so when I was first querying agents, I had no idea what I was doing. I was like a new author. I'm just cold pitching agents. And one agent who wanted to represent me suggested I rewrite the book from the perspective of Almisa.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I know. Which is, I think it's not a bad idea.
Yeah.
At that point, I had written this whole book, so I was like, well,
Yeah. Not going to do
no,
that.
I don't know if I'm up for that.
You made us thirst for something like that, though. I don't think it would have satisfied in the first go around, but now knowing what happened to Collins and crew, I almost want to see the behind the scenes of how they got him there.
No, thank you.
Which leads me to wonder, the Russians. There's a couple of hints. It's very interesting. She has the training manual, an old KGB relic. I
Yeah,
wonder how she got that. And then I also wonder the vials, you say that type of poison was right out of the Russian playbook. I was thinking
yeah,
like Novichok and how, we
yeah,
saw that was out of the Russian playbook.
yeah,
And then at the end, they kind of turn on Iran and then they want to back the Saudis.
yeah,
What was your intention with bringing Russia into this? Because obviously they're behind the scenes pulling a lot of strings when it comes to Iran and power
yeah.
dynamics.
Well, two things. One, I think they really do switch sides. They're so they're so slimy when it comes to everywhere, but especially in the Middle East. They're always just working whatever side is most advantageous to them. So I kind of wanted to work that in. It was convenient. Also, they're sort of the go-to source for assassinations. So
Right. Right.
that was also, that's what they're known for, unfortunately.
I just
But
want to know who reached out to who.
for Russia,
Like, did the Russians kind of go
oh
in and see an opportunity, or did Almais and Rashid in February 14th kind of say, we need some help from the masters of assassination? Like, who was recruiting who there?
in my mind, it was like February 14 was reaching out to the Russians, but that it was a mutually advantageous relationship.
Right, right.
Um, and by the way, that KGB manual taken from a real old KGB manual, like
Yeah.
it's verbatim. It's
Oh,
the
wow.
same. It's the same verbiage as the real
Yeah,
thing.
Collins reads that passage to himself twice, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny to read it. Like when I stumbled across it, I was like, oh my gosh, it's almost like a caricature of Americans, but
Hmm.
but accurate.
Right.
And yeah, and something, I don't know if you read any Jack Carr or had any overlap with him.
He's the same imprint as me, so a little.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Gotcha. He said the same thing. We have to adapt. We have to have the tactical advantage on the battlefield by adapting because our enemy is constantly adapting. And like if the
yeah,
Russian KGB manual from the whatever it was, 60s or 70s is still
yeah.
working, we have not adapted
No,
properly.
exactly. Yeah.
Right. I know. I know. I feel like the Russians are always one step ahead of us. They're all into soft warfare in America. It's like, propaganda and they're masters at that.
Masters of propaganda.
Yep,
Yeah.
sure.
So if you had to pick a favorite character, who would it be? Would it be Collins?
Oh my gosh. No one's asked me that. I don't
Oh,
even,
really?
yeah, nobody has asked me my favorite character.
Poppy Johnson. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, not Poppy Johnson.
I don't know if I dislike her or Collins more, to be honest.
Although she was also based on a kind of an amalgam of some real life. Medical tourism is a real thing. That
I
was
believe that.
among the wives, very, very popular.
I figured that had to be a real thing. Yeah.
Oh, for sure, for sure. My favorite character, I don't know, maybe Collins, I guess, just because like I lived inside his head for like 5 years.
Wow, 5 years. That's a long time.
I know, right? A long time to live in someone's head, but
yeah.
So what's the next character you're inside of? You have plans for book 2?
yeah, I do. I've been working on book 2. It's not coming quite as easily as book 1, but yeah, it's set in the Gaza conflict, which I know I don't, I'm sure people are going to have strong reactions to that, but
Good, it's intense.
Good.
I feel like writers should write about the hard topics.
Yeah.
Like they shouldn't, shy away from them. And so it's basically it's a female American case officer who becomes kidnapped by Hamas, and it's juxtaposed against the operation that brought her to Israel, which is a joint Mossad CIA assassination targeting a Hamas leader. And there's a link between the Hamas leader and her captor while she's being held hostage. So, but you don't find it out till the end. So one of my real life inspiration for the book is a guy named Morton Storm. I don't know if that name rings a bell to you.
No.
So he was a real life. He was a Danish guy who who converted to Islam, penetrated Al Qaeda in Yemen, and then turned and worked for Western intelligence, and then the U.S., and then went public with his story, and then had to kind of go live undercover because Al Qaeda was trying to kill him. So he wrote a memoir. Two CNN reporters co-authored it with him, and he's been on 60 Minutes. And I found his story so fascinating. So he's sort of my muse for one of the plot lines of my next book.
Oh,
that's spicy. Yeah, that's spicy what you're jumping into.
Give me feedback, because
Well, I guess I would ask, how recent are you going to go? Because this book gives us a little time jump back to the beginnings of the Arab Spring. Are you going to bring in October 7th, recent events, or are you just going to kind of go to that?
No, I mean, it pretty much takes place around October 7th.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's going to be exciting.
I know. It's a lot. It's
very intense.
It's intense. But I also, figure the publishing timeline is so slow that it will probably be a couple of years before it hits. So I think.
Okay.
So you were so comfortable with Bahrain, having lived there, and another strength, I can't believe we didn't even bring it up, is the setting in this book. Whether it's a meet at the Tree of Life. Chris and I both said after we read your book, we spent hours on Google Maps trying to drive around. I'm in Adlia. I'm in the expat communities looking at these big houses. Even during the F1 race, I'm not kidding. During the F1 race in Bahrain, I'm looking around to be like, is the Tree of Life like south of this track? How far away? Your setting is phenomenal. Did you have fun writing that from your memory, your experiences of these different areas and neighborhoods?
I did. I mean, that's actually my favorite part of writing. And, not everybody likes that. I get a lot of feedback like, oh, too many words and, just cut to the plot.
It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful.
No.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so I felt like Bahrain was a character in the book. I felt like it was as complex and changing and evolving as any of the humans in the book.
And alive, yeah.
Yeah. And I felt like to do it justice, to really make it a full-bodied character, I needed that level of detail, so that was my kind of motivation. Like I wanted you to be able to feel, everything about it, to have a 360-degree perspective of the place, to feel like you were there, to really understand Bahrain. I mean, in a weird way, it's almost to me like a love letter to Bahrain. I mean,
Mm.
I think I'm critical of the country, but I also think that, and it's not really a tourist destination, but I think there's so much depth and beauty and richness to the country that I hope my book brings that out.
Yeah, and it's there's a lot of areas like this that are like, war torn, that have such a rich history that
Yes.
people, because they're not tourist destinations, it's like you don't want it to be forgotten forever.
Yeah.
I remember, I don't know if you're ever watched like Anthony Bourdain, Parts Unknown, but I love when he would go to like he would never go to like Paris. He would go to like these random places. I think
Totally.
I think he was even in like Lebanon when it got bombed. But
Oh,
just like seeing, that side of it just gives you a whole new perspective about, these places have been here well before the war. It'll
yes.
be there after the war, and we need to preserve as much of it as we can. So,
Absolutely. I mean, my favorite places to write about are kind of the non-garden spots.
mhm.
I just think they have such depth and character. So, yeah.
It was also refreshing because you think Arab Spring, Bahrain doesn't come to mind for me at least. I'm thinking, are we going to be in Tahrir Square? Are we going to be in Tunisia when it kicks off? The complexities of the Syrian conflict. I feel like the same way David McCloskey took us to Syria in the heart of that conflict, you're doing with a perhaps less well-known, less well-publicized place, but teaching us this one place could have huge implications in the balance
Right.
of power in the Saudi-Iran struggle for the Gulf and
I-
for
yeah.
influence. And that's important. You're kind of raising that culture and that location up.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the time, really tectonic shifts start at a very small pinpoint. It doesn't have to be the big superpowers that launch these tectonic shifts. But B, I think Bahrain, obviously I lived there, so I could write about it. But it was interesting because it is sort of the battleground for for a proxy war, which
Yeah.
is somewhat unique in the Arab Spring more than some of the other countries. So I mean, it really was um, a place where you had Saudi Arabia on one side and Iran on the other, and both supporting their sides to fairly covertly, to varying degrees. But and that to me was so interesting.
Yeah, which makes me want to ask you something you did with Junaid I thought was really thought-provoking. And Chris and I had a discussion when we recorded our podcast of what does it mean to be successful and what really is a revolution? Did you intend when Junaid is kind of tossed to the side at the end? He was the symbol, right? They even in
Yeah,
the protest said, "We are moving" from his
yeah,
poetry, and his artwork mobilized a people, and his words gave
yeah,
strength to a people and a movement. Yet in the end, even though that revolutionary fervor was a tool manipulated by the Iranian masters or the powers that be, and ultimately you say he was just tossed aside. Everything he did for the movement, once the movement took over, it lost its ideals. It lost the reason for doing what it was doing. And someone like Junaid was this huge symbol. Even symbols like that get trampled underfoot by larger powers. Was that intentional?
100%. Yes,
What a
absolutely.
move.
I think we see it time and again, and we particularly saw it in the Arab Spring. I mean, the Arab Spring, I didn't want anyone to lose sight in my book of the fact that the Arab Spring was fundamentally a legitimate democratic movement.
Mhm.
I mean, and I didn't, my book, Iran kind of hijacks it. And, they hijack a lot of things, but, but I didn't want to tarnish the legitimate democratic movement underneath it, which certainly existed. But you see it over and over in the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring failed. I mean, it failed
Right.
for similar reasons that, the democracy part of it didn't succeed. And
Right.
it was, the real, true revolutionaries, the ones who really were advocating for the right things, kind of got sidelined. So, and by the way, Junaid was modeled after a real life dissident who's still in jail in Bahrain named Al
Wow.
Khawaja. Yeah,
Oh,
What
wow.
was the
Okay.
name
Didn't
there?
know that.
Khawaja is his last name, Al Khawaja.
Wow, I'm going to look that up. So that speaks to taking a wider view, US policy. I feel like, and you were in the throes of it. So US policy, I feel like was really shifted or torn. And I don't know what was it like working on the ground when obviously we want to support the ideals of an Arab Spring, but we also know those types of revolutions are ripe for the wrong powers to be inserted. And ultimately, a lot of the despots were our allies, as we see here in this book.
Exactly.
What was it
Exactly.
like balancing that for U.S. Policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a clear answer. I think policymakers struggle with it even now. I think, Bahrain is sort of our ally. I mean, it is our ally. We have a naval base there. And at the end of the day, as I mentioned in our book, Iran is the bigger threat than a dictatorial a monarchy, in the Gulf.
Hmm.
And same with Saudi Arabia. So we do kind of look the other way or have a very tepid response when there are really gross human rights violations. I mean, the monarchy
Yes.
committed really gross human rights violations and
Sure.
continues to do so. And, workers are horribly exploited there. I think that I tried to bring that out in my book too, how much they were sort of used and abused by everyone.
Right.
And that was all based on real life too, where these workers would come and their sponsors would take their documents and then basically extort them. They would
Right.
they make them work like slaves and charge them money for their documents back, and that was all real. So, but that's what happens with a dictatorship. When there are no labor laws and people don't have rights, and the Shia were largely excluded from all these different government agencies, and the U.S. is kind of like, well, bad, but what can we do? That's sort of the US's response. And I don't have an answer. I mean, because I get it. I get that the US has to kind of weigh, the pros and cons, weigh the different factors. So
And then the flip side, the trains ran on time, or the sewage was picked up, and these
right,
certain infrastructures were running for the country under the king. And is that worth losing some freedom, or losing some
well,
rights, or creating a second class
Mhm.
citizenry in the
yep,
Shia
yep,
to have the trains run on time? That's
right.
a dangerous thing to play with.
There's that, and also I think increasingly I think we've seen the last couple of years that the world is not divided into countries that are right and countries that are wrong, into perfect democracies and imperfect countries, imperfect governments. I mean, I think it's a spectrum, and I mean, it's interesting. We look at our own country,
Look at ours. Yeah.
exactly, we look at our own country, or like some of the countries in Eastern Europe, like Hungary, which was like a model of democracy following the collapse of communism, right? Or Poland, right? And those countries are now backsliding. And it's at a certain point, you're like, well, I don't know. Who are we?
Hmm.
Who are we to tell other countries that they should be better? I don't know that we're so great ourselves. So,
That's right.
Yeah.
there's an element of that too.
Yeah. You got us thinking, man. You got us thinking. All
Yeah,
these things
like
are on the
it's a
mind.
cerebral book. It's a very erudite book. I think it has like this academic edge to it that really elevates the story.
I mean, I love that you think that, because that I wanted people to think about the calculus of foreign policy. That was a huge part of my book. It was, these conflicts and interventions and involvements are complex, and they're not, it's so easy nowadays for people to just say, do this, do that, and you don't realize how nuanced these conflicts are,
Mm.
Yeah.
and really how painstaking the calculus is.
Until you place yourself into a position like a Rashid, or like an Almaisa, and understand where they're coming from, you can never really make that judgment yourself.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
It's also funny. I ended up liking Whitney the second time around.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, I could see that. Yeah.
I don't know
I
why.
think
The
he was just
first
young and naive. That's what I took
Well,
it
the
as.
first time I bought into that hook, line, and sinker because Collins was telling me he's young, he's naive, he's kind of pudgy, he's taking his girl, he's all these things. He seems so slimy. And then on the second reread, he's actually saying all the right things. He's trying to either push Collins in a certain direction, or he's trying to play the game. He's
Yeah.
clearly not as corrupt as the Admiral.
Right. Right.
And he clearly wants Collins to be a better spy and get him better at his
Yes.
career. He almost wants to be a mentor to him, give him that tough love
Yeah.
occasionally. Almost everything Whitney says early on in the book makes sense. He's on at doing his job as station chief. He's on the right path. And at first I was like, he's this Weasley kind of slime ball, because that's what Collins was telling me.
Right.
Yeah.
But he's much deeper than that.
He is. And I think there's a line toward the end after Collins is, Whitney tells Collins, you're going to have to curtail your tour and get sent home, which really happens, by the way. They do that sometimes. And then Colin sees Whitney at a bar, and he says, there's this moment. It's one of the last times he sees Whitney, and he says, I saw him for the first time or for the last time or whatever, as he is, which is just kind of a pawn. Like that he wasn't maybe as evil as Collins had thought him to be the whole time. That he was sort of being manipulated like everyone in the book.
Right. Right.
And also, I don't know if you guys saw this. I don't know that anyone picked up on this, but I tried at the very end, in the epilogue. Collins mentions how Whitney's parents, when they heard of his death, were pretty cold, and that kind of this picture Whitney had painted of this idyllic home life with these diplomat parents
wasn't true.
Was not true.
Yeah.
And that was no one's ever mentioned that to me in any book talk, so I don't know if anyone got it, but to me, I was trying to be like, maybe there was more going on to Whitney. Like he had his own sort of demons and heartbreak to deal with that you never really get to fully see in the book.
I was much more sympathetic. Yeah, hearing things like that, I was much more sympathetic to him when I reread it.
And I think like once you realize that maybe for a while there, I was convinced that was him and Almisa in that, shack. But then, I guess we're supposed to be taken to believe that, it was actually Jimmy. And when you realize that he was being played by Almisa and that it wasn't the other way around, he like you said, he's a pawn.
He went back for her though. And that shows something.
Right. Exactly. And you said it, that everyone has baggage, and people who do these crazy things tend to have these messed up stories, and we never truly know what everyone is, who everyone is. Yeah.
Exactly. So, did you guys think that they were having an affair, Whitney and Almisa?
I think
she was playing
for her.
him.
Yeah.
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 Yes, they were. Yeah.
He was obviously the big fish she was trying to catch. And I do think she used her appeal, let's say, to kind of sway him. Is that the right reading?
Well, I get different opinions on it. I always keep my own interpretation to myself because.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Fair enough.
Because Collins didn't know who was playing the guitar. So we never heard Whitney could actually play the guitar. But he did say he has the voice only a station chief would have, or the confidence when he speaks.
Right.
But I think he was drunk that night, stumbling out the window. Like, I don't know.
You don't know. One of those unanswered questions.
Yeah.
That's it's great stuff. You really took us on a ride with this. You really made us feel like we should be more perceptive to these things all along. And you pulled the rug out from under our feet and almost felt like we were caught in the espionage game that all these characters were caught in as the reader. And that was a lot of fun.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Well, we don't want to take much of your time. It's late here on the night, and I know it's spring break for you guys. But one tradition we have on the Thriller podcast is a lot of our guests whose books we've loved and who we've enjoyed chatting with, we leave them with a special limerick. And so I have a limerick for you all about the Peacock and the Sparrow.
Awesome.
A spy at the top of their game, but Shane Collins not be his name. Rashid in his plot, unseat a despot, as Almisa puts them all to shame.
I love that. That's amazing.
Well, thank you for giving us Almisa,
yes,
Rashid, Collins. Thank you.
You just synopsized my whole book in limerick form.
Mike has gotten pretty good at these. He started this. I guess, when did you start this, Mike? Like a little bit towards year one, and then it just stuck. Yeah,
a couple of years worth of limericks. Yeah,
I keep telling him I'm going to put them all into a book for him when we're done. So
I'm going to put that on the my paperback cover.
There you go.
We'll post it for you. We'll put it in our Goodreads and Amazon review, and we'll try to get your word out there. Peacock and the Sparrow, guys. If you haven't checked it out, you shouldn't have listened to this because there were a lot of spoilers. So go back and read it a second time because we know most of you guys read it once already. And Alana Berry, thanks for joining us. We look forward to that book about Gaza.
Thank you so much, you guys. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for taking the time. Oh,
fantastic.
By the way, we love your cover. We're big on covers here.
Cover.
Oh. And we like the cover. We just saw a new print of the cover where you've switched the colors.
Yeah.
That was pretty cool. Like, did you have any input on the cover? We know some authors don't.
They were gonna go with just the same cover but in paperback.
Okay.
And I was like, can we do something different? You know, and then they presented those colors to me, and I was like, boom, because that's just the theme of my book, you know,
Yeah.
when sometimes the ground is the sky and the sky is the ground.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I love it. I love it.
Everything's inverted.
The only other thing I want to know about the cover is that a green apple cigarette? It has to be, right?
I think it does. Yeah.
Okay.
Do those exist? We were wondering about that. Are those real?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, I looked at every detail is real in that
That's
book.
great. That's great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Thank
Go
you,
have fun.
guys.
Thank you.
Didn't
Thanks
want
so
to take you
much.
away from the family. Yep.
Oh no, it was my pleasure. Thank you
Nice
so
to
much.
meet you.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye. All right. We got to thank our patrons, our special operators, Sherry F. and Jason. Our special agents, Ben, Daryl, Kevin, George, Matt, Don, Peggy, and Mark. Please subscribe, rate, and review. You can find us at thrillerpod.com or on Twitter and Instagram at Thriller Podcast. And as always, just like Collins, be Collins.